place where the sidewalk ends and before the street begins. And there the grass grows soft and white, and there the sun burns crimson bright, and there the moonbird rests from his flight to cool in the peppermint wind. Well, apparently, the Nashville, Tennessee City Council are huge fans of that famous poem by Shel Silverstein because they have mandated that property owners all over the city build sidewalks that end. However, the Sixth Circuit has said that violates the Constitution. And we're going to talk about that this week on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on August 25th, 2023, and I am super excited about this episode with two special guests. This, I believe, is the first Short Circuit in history. We've made almost 300 episodes now. The first in history with an all Minnesota contingent. Both of my guests live and practice in Minnesota. I live in Minnesota. However, the cases we're going to talk about are not from Minnesota, although there might be a little Minnesota thrown in. But I just think it's super special that this Star of the North is going to contain all three of us on the show today. So I will introduce these special Minnesotans in a moment. First, however, I have a special announcement, and that is that we at the Center for Judicial Engagement are hiring. We are hiring a new position. It is a senior fellow, somebody who will work with me and others at the Center for Judicial Engagement to do things like scholarship and writing and all kinds of other stuff that we do at the center. So if you are interested, we'll put a link in the show notes to apply. The guidelines are we're applying people with a law degree with 5+ years of experience, but there's some other details and you can check that out either at the link or just go to the IJ jobs page and you can see it there. We're also hiring in, as we often are in other areas, if you are a recent grad or about to be a grad of law school, we are hiring different kind of fellows in those areas, litigation fellow, and then we also have a fellowship for people between clerkships. If you're going to have a gap between clerkships coming up, please check us out. And of course, we also have our law clerk, our Dave Kennedy fellows, that will be next summer. And if you are a current law student, look for those. You can apply for those later this fall. But today, it's all about the Minnesotans. So the first Minnesotan I'm going to introduce is a partner at a firm here in Minneapolis, Lockridge, Grindle, Nowen. Did I get that right, Dave?
You got it.
Yes, he is a partner there, David Asp. He is a big-time ERISA and other facets of the law litigator. He is also getting to be an expert on the North Dakota Constitution. If you want to know about North Dakota constitutional matters, Dave is the guy to talk to, even though he doesn't actually live in North Dakota, although he grew up across the river from it. I also need to disclose that Dave and I did share an apartment a couple years in law school, a couple different apartments, one of which wasn't cleaned very often. I was trying to remember if we had a vacuum. I don't really remember a vacuum.
There's no way we had a vacuum. We had,
but we were also in each other's weddings at different times. So I want to get that on the table. It doesn't mean I won't have hard-hitting questions for his analysis, which is going to be about an ERISA case, which is an area of law we don't talk about much on Short Circuit, but it has huge consequences for Americans. The facts of this case are pretty astounding on like what's going on under the subsurface of our healthcare system and how the ERISA statute interacts with that. So Dave is going to explain that in a little bit. And first, I want to welcome him to Short Circuit.
Well, thanks, Anthony. It's great to be here, and thank you for that introduction about what I have as kind of an eclectic litigation practice in North Dakota. But you're right, I am in Minnesota, and you're also right that we are friends. We lived roommates in law school, and lived a lifestyle that I wouldn't recommend to anyone, and a lot of filth in the
Yes.
apartment.
A lot of cold, too.
A lot of cold and filth.
To save money at times.
Yeah.
I remember reading textbooks with gloves on at one point, which I don't think we actually saved a lot of money on that. Anyway, someone who does not read with gloves on, I think he's much smarter than that, is another friend of mine, Ryan Wilson. So Ryan was a clerk for us at IJ. He was a litigation fellow. He's now in private practice here in Minnesota. He was also a clerk on the Minnesota Supreme Court for Justice Barry Anderson. And he's going to talk about some more kind of bread and butter of short circuit, a takings case, the one from Nashville I referred to earlier. But first, welcome, Ryan, back to the show.
It's great to be here. Great to be back.
Well, Dave, you're going to take us down south from Minnesota to Oklahoma. And apparently they were not fans of how their pharmacies were distributing their drugs, but that ran into this friend of ours named ERISA.
Mm-hmm. That's right, Anthony. Thanks. And I am glad this is the first ERISA case you've had to discuss on Short Circuit. I think
I think maybe at some point, the show had an ERISA case before. But
you might have had one slip in
much.
Previously.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that I could leverage our friendship to get on the show and talk about ERISA because I know it's what the listeners want. And they get enough of the First Amendment, enough of your forfeiture, takings, cases, constitutional litigation, and they're really saying, what's going on with ERISA preemption? And so the case I'm talking about today is an interesting 10th Circuit case, and I think I can make the case that this will be very interesting for your listeners because they care about the Circuit Court of Appeals and what might be coming at the Supreme Court, or if there's maybe laying the groundwork for might be coming at the Supreme Court. And so the case I'm talking about is the Pharmaceutical Care Management Association versus Mulready. Mulready is the insurance commissioner of Oklahoma. And the case is about Oklahoma's Patients' Right to Pharmacy Choice Act. That's an act that regulates pharmacy benefit managers. So pharmacy benefit manager is the intermediary between the pharmacies and your prescription drug plans. So they're called PBMs, and what they'll do is they'll create pharmacy networks, they'll contract with pharmacists to create those networks, they'll negotiate prices for drugs, and then they will give those options to plans, and plans will contract with the PBMs to provide those services. So the court order explains, and it's sort of true throughout the cases in this area, that the concern about PBMs is that, one, they can decide how much to pay the pharmacies for the drugs in their network agreements. And then, two, most of the largest PBMs also have affiliations with health plans or with pharmacies of their own. And so the concern is that those large, like CVS Caremark, for example, is a large Caremark's the PBM, CVS, a large retail pharmacy. And the concern is that maybe their Caremark's incentives are to benefit CVS and at the detriment of smaller independent or rural pharmacies. So at this point, almost every state has enacted a PBM regulation. Usually the regulations are focused on protecting your brick and mortar pharmacies, your independent pharmacies, and retail pharmacy locations. Especially, there were concerns about, they also have concerns about lack of transparency because the PBMs don't necessarily share with the pharmacies how much they're paying for the drugs. And in some cases, there have been reports of the PBM paying the pharmacy, reimbursing them for a drug in an amount less than what the pharmacy itself actually pays.
So I should ask at this point for people familiar with our economic liberty work at IJ, it sounds probably to a lot of listeners, it sounds like just good old fashioned naked protectionism, put ERISA aside even between the brick and mortar stores and the other businesses. But is there also maybe, some kind of, I know it doesn't come up in this context, but like an antitrust argument for why this isn't just, pure naked protection? Maybe it's misguided policy, but there's some reason there that's not just we're trying to protect one business at the expense of the other.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly have been antitrust cases relating to PBM conducts, usually in the context of a particular drug or with respect to the relationship of the pharmacy. I think that is the growing area of litigation. What the states have been trying to do is to respond to constituent concerns that they can't see the pharmacist of their choice. So the issue often comes down to, I live in a small community. I'd like to be able to go to my longtime local pharmacist, but that pharmacist has a problem with the PBM in that they get reimbursed for drugs at an amount less than what they actually pay for it. So they're losing money by agreeing with the PBM. So there's a lot of, that's part of the problem. And then the problem of networks where a PBM might say, well, we're going to prefer our own mail order pharmacy over that local retail pharmacy in a rural area, and so they give incentives for plan participants to use that pharmacy at the expense of the local independent. That's what the state legislators have been trying to get at, and that's been going on for a long time. And like I said, most states have that restriction. What's kind of changed in recent years has been that in the past, the PCMA here, which is the plaintiff in this case, and the Association for PBMs, has sued on these laws under ERISA's preemption provision, arguing that they're preempted by federal law and can't be enforced by the state. Those lawsuits were succeeding before 2020. I would say in the Eighth Circuit, there were a number of lawsuits in, I believe, Iowa, Arkansas, and North Dakota that found the PBM regulations to be preempted. But then in 2020, the Supreme Court took up one of the cases in the Arkansas law in a case called Rutledge versus PCMA. And in Rutledge, the court found that Arkansas's law was not preempted and focused on whether the state law relates to the ERISA plan and has a connection to. So let me take a step back here and talk about the actual language of the preemption clause, because this case, like Oklahoma's case in Rutledge, is going to turn on the language of ERISA, which says that ERISA shall supersede any state law insofar as they may now or hereafter relate to any employee benefit plan. So it supersedes any law that relates to an employee benefit plan. That's extremely broad. And so to help identify what might relate to an ERISA plan, the Supreme Court's test is it relates to an ERISA plan if it has a connection with or a reference to such a plan.
Wow, that's super helpful.
It's super helpful. And so all you have to do is say, does it have a connection with an ERISA plan? And if it does, it's preempted. You can imagine how this has been difficult to apply and how it's resulted in a lot of litigation over the years. But in Rutledge, the court sort of looked at this standard, looked at the state regulation of PBMs, and tried to give a little bit more specificity, saying that it has a connection with an ERISA plan if it has to do with they basically said we're primarily concerned with laws that require providers to structure plans in a certain way, to structure plan benefits in a certain way. So we know it's preempted if it requires payments of benefits in a certain way, or if it requires certain rules that require someone to be a beneficiary under the plan. So we know it's preempted. It has a connection with if it specifically directs benefits in some way. But Rutledge said it's not preempted if it just increased the cost to the plan or alters the incentive. So before that, laws were preempted. The argument was the law is preempted because this creates more expenses for the plan, right? We're just regulating the PBM here, not the plan. But the PBM's conduct is going to increase the cost for the plan or maybe change the incentives for the benefits to the plan. And that's not sufficient for ERISA preemption to apply. You have to actually affect the benefit structure. So after the court's decision in Rutledge, like for example, the Eighth Circuit reconsidered the North Dakota law, which did create specific incentives around benefit design, and said, well, that's not preempted because it has a de minimis, it's not central to plan administration, and so it doesn't have a connection with the plan. So that's getting a little more clarity. Now, coming on the Oklahoma law, the question now is how close to influencing, hindering, changing benefits can you get before you're actually requiring payment of benefits or creating rules, before you're crossing the line into actually mandating a certain benefit design. And the Oklahoma law did basically four things. It required PBMs to assure that its members had access to brick and mortar pharmacies. So depending on where you live, a certain number of brick and mortar retail pharmacies had to be available to you. You can't rely just on mail order. It also precluded the PBM from creating incentives to use mail order instead of the brick and mortar. And it said that any willing pharmacy had to be able, that was in the network, had to be able to participate in a preferred network. So the PBM couldn't have a preferred network for just its affiliated pharmacies beyond if the other pharmacies were willing to agree to those terms, those same terms. And then finally, it said the PBM can't terminate a pharmacy from its network or otherwise take adverse action against it just because one of the pharmacists is on probation with the state pharmacy board. And the 10th Circuit considered those laws and said these are preempted by ERISA because they actually affect plan benefit design. By saying that you have to have a certain number of brick and mortar pharmacies, you're basically precluding the plan benefit design that's just mail order. And so because you're precluding that type of benefit design, that has a, quote, hindrance on the benefits themselves. That analysis is really, I think, at odds with the 8th Circuit's analysis on the North Dakota law in a case called Wiebe, PCMA versus Wiebe, which had a different types of restrictions in some ways, some not so frequently, but that case talked more about, look, you're creating incentives on the benefits. I mean, you might increase the costs to the plan, but that's not mandating a particular type of benefit. And the language in the Supreme Court decision, the language in Rutledge that they're focusing on, talks about the structure of plan benefits, like requiring payment of benefits or creating rules for beneficiary status. And these laws don't do that. So I think there's a question here about the question is really how close to incentives can you get before you're actually mandating a certain type of plan design. And that's the central issue in this case.
And the big plans, right, that they argue, or these networks argue that those kind of structures can have big consequences for the cost of the drugs in the end, right?
Right. And that was the argument of Rutledge too, right? Because Rutledge was saying things like, look, the Arkansas law in Rutledge said, look, if a pharmacist is going to lose money by prescribing a drug, if you're going to reimburse them for the drug at an amount less than what they paid for it, they can refuse to fill it. And so that's essentially a decision about the plan, right? Because otherwise a plan could say, well, we would like to have those provisions in there because it saves the plan money ultimately, at least arguably it does. And so that it all will affect the plan financially one way or another. And I think that's not enough. The question is how close to designing benefits like networks, for example, can you get before you're actually crossing the line into changing the structure of plan benefits. And then I want to make two really specific points about the opinion because I think there's sort of the more interesting pieces that might be subject to further debate in the future. And one of them, so I'm sure you and all of your listeners are now following along and have the opinion in front of them and have been reading it.
Of course.
They can pull over and maybe start looking at it. But at page 12 of the opinion, it cites the definition for any willing provider, which again is the one that says that if you have a provider in the network and they want to be preferred, that you have to let them be preferred if they'll agree to the same terms as everyone else. And that the court says, no, what this provision actually says is that any pharmacy gets to be in your network if they'll agree to the terms. And when I read that, I thought, I just am not sure that's what the statute actually says. And the analysis for this discussion is in the footnote 9 of the opinion. But let me just read you the language and see what you think. It says that a PBM can't deny the provider the opportunity to participate in any pharmacy network at preferred participation status if the provider is willing to accept terms and conditions. So it says any pharmacy network at preferred participation status. I think that means you can't deny them the opportunity to be a preferred pharmacy in the network. It doesn't mean, the court says, that you have to allow every pharmacy into the network.
Well, yeah, because it says they have to accept the terms.
We have to accept the terms, but any network at preferred participation status. So I think the district court read it the same way that I'm looking at it. The 10th Circuit disagreed, and in the footnote explained why it disagreed. But I think that's a really interesting part of this opinion is that the court's fundamental view of what the law does is based on the interpretation of Oklahoma law, because it would have a more significant impact on plan design if any pharmacy would have to be allowed in the network, as opposed to just
would that mean that it might not? We could talk now about its future. That it might not be a good vehicle at the Supreme Court on this, wide issue and the conflict with the Eighth Circuit. If maybe there's just an argument it misread state law, and so this just isn't a great case.
That may be, and it may be that Oklahoma can go back and revise the law. I don't know that would really solve the court's broader concern about what it's doing to plan benefits. But the other issue that is really, I think, at odds with the Eighth Circuit's decision, where there seems to be a clear circuit split, is another provision of Oklahoma's law, which says that a PBM can't deny, limit, or terminate a pharmacist from its network just because the pharmacist is on probation with the State Board of Pharmacy. So it just says if you're on probation, that can't be the only reason that you're terminated. It doesn't say that the PBM couldn't have its own quality assurance requirements or its own review. It just says that can't be the only reason. And the court says that's preempted because it goes too far the court says, forces the plan to capitulate to all pharmacies, even if they're on probation. Now, the Wiebe case in the Eighth Circuit that involved a North Dakota law that actually said that PBMs couldn't require certain accreditation and certification requirement for pharmacists. So they said you can't require it to go beyond state law. And that wasn't preempted. So you have the Eighth Circuit saying that even greater requirements, really, saying that you can't have a requirement beyond state law is not preempted, and the 10th Circuit saying this is, to me, seems like they're in conflict. The other thing, the fundamental question, which is kind of interesting in these cases, comes out of Justice Thomas's concurring opinion in Rutledge, where, and it will not surprise you to hear, he took the position that the court's ERISA preemption jurisprudence kind of has missed the point here all along. And when the statute says that ERISA supersedes state law that relates to a plan, supersede means that ERISA has to first talk about the issue. If ERISA regulates it, the state can't regulate it, sort of a conflict preemption. And not the way that the courts have analyzed it, where they look to, well, even if Congress didn't regulate this area in ERISA, does it have a connection with an ERISA benefit plan? And interestingly, in the Rutledge concurrence, Justice Thomas talked about every state law where they have found ERISA to preempt the state law has involved a matter that's explicitly addressed by ERISA since 1995. So in at least the last 30 years almost, that's been the case. So that might be another reason why the Supreme Court might be interested in this case again. I mean, it just had an ERISA preemption case in 2020. So I'm not, you may have a better sense than me about what they'd be interested in taking. Certainly your listeners are clamoring for more ERISA content, and so they would want the court to take it. But, and I would think it'd be interesting, but I'm not sure if that ultimately ends up.
Is there a potential this case could be mooted? ERISA, I'm no expert, I've understood, has been amended from time to time. And is it possible? This is pretty popular among the states, it looks like. Is it possible any legislative change could allow states to enact this kind of legislation?
Certainly. I mean, I think the PBM legislation at the federal level could do it. I mean, if the Congress were to pass regulations similar, then they're clearly speaking on the subject. And that's sort of what the 10th Circuit says at the end. They say, we understand that you have concerns about independent pharmacists and these practices, but that's for Congress, not for Oklahoma to decide. So I think if a federal legislation passed, I imagine that would influence it. But until then, states will have, most states, we mentioned we're all Minnesotans. Minnesota has a PBM regulation. Almost every state does. So this is an issue that's going to keep on coming up in the future. Yeah.
So thanks, Dave, for that exploration of ERISA preemption. And a lot of people probably, they first heard that we're going to talk about an ERISA case on the show, maybe rolled their eyes or move to the next podcast. But it is, I like that we're talking about it because it is a massively impactful statute that a lot of people don't have much of a clue about. But the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 has had a massive shaping of our healthcare system for good or for bad in a lot of ways. Also, your retirement dollars, and if you participate with a healthcare plan through your employer, which is pretty close to a majority of Americans, it has an impact on you. And this case said that these PPMs, which I know almost nothing about, that 270 million Americans, so like 80% of us, participate through these and get when we need prescriptions, get our drugs through these. So this is a seismic part of our legal system that goes to the Supreme Court a lot on this on preemption issues. And I used to litigate it a little bit in private practice, and it's as clear as mud. This whole preemption thing, and the Supreme Court has, to some extent, I think, done the best it can, or maybe not quite the best it can, as Justice Thomas would say, on trying to figure out this broad language from Congress out. But it is in no way an issue that has been solved by the court, and the court will keep addressing it, and as will the courts of appeals. So we'll see where this goes. We're also going to see where takings law goes. And so takings law has been interesting the last few years. The court has put a little more teeth in the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. We had separately from takings law, but broadly on property rights, we had a show about a year ago where we talked about the city of Nashville, Tennessee, and its regulation of property rights. We talked about a really interesting article that our friend Radley Balco wrote about fines and fees that the city puts on property owners. And we also talked about a case of ours with our colleague Paul Avalar that we've had there for a while now about home-based businesses. And Ryan is going to now bring us a case that I had somehow missed that came out in May about sidewalks in the city and how they're just not doing things by the Constitution. And yet I think this is a case that probably would have gone the other way a few years ago before some of the Supreme Court's recent taking cases. So Ryan, take it away, and I want you to please tell us where the sidewalk ends.
Well, we will get to that at the end, but I think you'll find, unfortunately, that's an unsatisfactory answer in this case. So here we have Knight versus the Metro Government of Nashville and Davidson County, which we'll refer to as Nashville, coming out of the Sixth Circuit by way of the Middle District of Tennessee in Nashville. So apparently Nashville's been a growing city, population's been increasing, and their sidewalks have not caught up with them. The court talks about how they have a fairly high pedestrian death index, almost double the national average, and they've tried to fix that problem by building more sidewalks. And so they set aside some money, increased their capital budget, but unfortunately, it would take them 20 years to cover at that rate the number of critical miles needed. So Nashville passes an ordinance and says, we can solve this problem quicker. We're going to make new building owners, people applying for a permit, we're going to make them either build a sidewalk on their property, build a sidewalk somewhere else, or give us some money, and we'll decide what to do with it. So as you can imagine, a couple of landowners applied for permits, and James Knight and Jason Mays, And I want to note for a second, the court does something I really enjoy in this opinion. They put pictures. I always enjoy, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Definitely saves some time trying to
those
describe.
pictures really helped crystallize the issue, I think.
Yeah. And so you can see, one of the homeowners wanted to expand, wanted to tear down a smaller building and put a larger home on it, and could not come to an agreement with how the sidewalk should be built, and never ended up getting a permit. One of the other landowners, Mays by comparison, he had an empty lot. He built his property. Paid the in lieu fees, and then wanted a refund. Said, "Hey, this is unconstitutional. I don't think I should be paying this," and they denied his refund. So goes to the Middle District of Tennessee. Middle District of Tennessee looks at the law and weighs these two competing tests. And so the two tests that are out there are Penn Central, balancing, really a balancing test, very relatively favorable for the government, versus the Nolan-Dolan, which is called Nolan Standard, which has several other factors that tend to weigh much more towards landowners and property rights and finding a taking, and what the court characterizes as a unconstitutional condition. So, for example, in order to get a permit, you have to let the government take your property and have that be an uncompensated compensated taking. So. I should say the government also argued in the Middle District for a rational basis test. As you know, Anthony, the government loves a good rational basis test.
Yeah, why not throw that in there?
The district court didn't bite and said we see nothing in any Supreme Court precedent or Sixth Circuit precedent that would allow us to apply the rational basis test here. They then go through the Middle District goes through the state of the law and. Applies Penn Central. And so what you had in the lower courts is the government basically abandoning any argument under Nolan-Dolan, and the property owners not arguing at all for Penn Central. And so this is going to be decided, purely on a matter of law and which test applies. And so it goes up to the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit does a great job walking through when Penn Central applies, what it should apply to, this Nolan-Dolan test, which it finds really is on point here, that it's tailored. This is a condition to a permit that's requiring you to give up some property or pay some fees, which the Supreme Court has also found applies under the Nolan-Dolan standard in its Coots test, and it comes to the conclusion that the test that should apply in the Sixth Circuit is the Nolan-Dolan test. And so one of the arguments has to do with, does it matter if it's a administrative ad hoc determination or taking, or if it's part of some broader, widely applicable legislative scheme? And there's a split among circuits. The 10th Circuit goes one way. The 9th Circuit recently reversed itself, and a big split among states. So, for example, in the 9th Circuit, the 9th Circuit says it doesn't matter if it's administrative or legislative, whereas the state of California still makes that distinction. And so you have a real mess nationwide as to states, versus federal courts, and who and what tests are applying here, and does it matter if it's legislative or administrative? And so the court takes a step back and it looks at the history of the Fifth Amendment. Traces it back to, does some originalist arguments, traces it back to England, and says it really doesn't matter who's doing the taking. It doesn't matter if it's local bureaucrat, local administrator, or legislature. It's what's being taken, and ultimately comes to the conclusion that it doesn't matter. The Nolan-Dolan test applies here because it's an unconstitutional condition. But because these arguments were abandoned below, it does not reach the answer about whether under the Nolan test you can require somebody to build a sidewalk to nowhere, and so that'll have to be left for a future case as to whether that has the appropriate nexus and the proportionality under the Nolan test.
And it was interesting that the city, it seems, really didn't try at all to say that the requiring the sidewalk would be proportional. under the test, which was interesting to me because Nolan Dolan is this. It's called Nolan Dolan for listeners' benefit, by the way, because it's two cases from the 90s called Nolan and Dolan. It's better if you're a property owner. It's better than having the Penn Central test, where I think the rule of thumb usually is like you have to lose 90% of your value before you can say something's a taking under the Penn Central test. But under Nolan Dolan, so it's better for the property owner, but it's not a sure thing. And, I could see them arguing, well, if you get a sidewalk, if you build on the property, then of course you're going to have people there and everyone needs a sidewalk to be safe, even if it's not maybe for people passing by. And so it makes sense that you would pay for the sidewalk. They didn't even try that. It was just, we're going to put all our eggs in the Penn Central basket. I guess that could be poor litigating, but I wonder if, when you actually look at the costs and everything, the writing is on the wall that is not going to pass the test.
Well, before this case, there was a I don't call it a split, but disagreement among the lower courts in the Sixth Circuit as to which test applied. And so this is the second. There was a case that came up prior where they didn't have the opportunity to resolve this, what they called an interesting question. And so I do think there was an appetite to finally decide which test applies here. But at the same time, again, with the government pushing for the rational basis test, I think part of it is there's a certain presumption by the government that the court will want to defer to them, and so I think making no arguments at all. I can't speak for them as to why they abandoned that argument completely. Because one could make an argument that new developments, we need you to put sidewalks, even if right now there's sidewalks to nowhere, because as more people develop, there will be connections to your neighboring sidewalks and may be able to pass the nexus test. It's your properties. It'd be more difficult to require somebody to build a sidewalk 30 miles away from their property, but certainly on your property, and also granting an easement. One could make an argument for that.
Well, that seems to be what really killed maybe and maybe this is why they didn't argue it, is that you could have the sidewalk built, but you could also pay the sidewalk money for this sidewalk built miles from your house. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't seem to have much of a, quote, nexus. And so really that's a tax. So if they, the city could structure it differently, that everyone, I don't know, could pay, that's a pretty hefty tax, but could pay a tax or could build a sidewalk. You just don't get a choice. You have to build a sidewalk. Do you think that would have passed muster here if just everyone has to build a sidewalk?
It might have. And that, as I dug into this, that's one of the questions a lot of scholarship tries to discuss is when does it become a tax versus a taking? Mm-hmm. And, what is that balancing act? And that's ultimately what a lot of this is going to come down to. And if the Supreme Court ever resolves this is, how broad does the legislation have to be to apply to everybody? Obviously in Euclid, it was, the zoning applies, universally to everyone, right? And so that's one end. And the Sixth Circuit talks a little bit about this, but this is a little bit closer to putting the burden of everybody on a particular, landowner. So where in between does that cross the line where you can regulate everybody equally versus, for example, people building new homes? And there's a case, there's a case in front of this, a cert petition in front of the Supreme Court. It'll be discussed in September on this issue. This case came down between the original petition and the reply, and they were able to get it in there. And so we'll see if the court takes us up this opportunity. Justice Thomas has written several concurrences and dissents to denial of cert, saying this is a question that should get resolved, this administrative legislative distinction. And so we'll see if the court takes it up.
So can I ask the question about the distinction? I mean, as you said, it seems like they didn't even try on one of the tests, but the court describes that there's no case in which there's a basis for treating legislative conditions differently from administrative conditions. Has this caught on separately, or just as someone who's not familiar with this area, I'm thinking about where is this coming from? Where's Nashville's position that is staking everything on coming from here? Yeah,
so in Nolan and Dolan, more in Nolan, they talked about how these were administrative ad hoc decisions. And so a lot of government entities will look to some of the language of Nolan and say, "Oh, see, it's clear that the Supreme Court was focused on the fact this was administrative in nature. It gave too much discretion to an individual." But when you take a step back, and this is something that cert petition I was mentioning discusses, well, Nolan was really the application of a broader legislative scheme that required dedication of beach access. And so there's an argument not just whether this applies to legislative or administrative, but when is something administrative versus legislative? And we see this on, for example, rezoning petitions. When you ask the government to rezone your particular property, normally zoning and rezoning is seen as legislative. But when it applies to your particular property and it's factors that are related to your development, well, then does that become more administrative or quasi-administrative, quasi-legislative? And so the court, I think rightfully so, here in the Sixth Circuit says it doesn't matter. Because it's, your property's being taken, doesn't matter if it's being done by one person or a couple people on a council or city council versus a planning commission. It's still a taking, and that's the easiest way to resolve this. And so I think that's probably the likely outcome of this. I don't know, Anthony, if you have any.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And this is a really good case. I was really pleased that you suggested this case for the show, because it shows the whole history, I think, of this Nolan-Dolan test shows kind of what makes for a good case, good facts in a property case, but then also how courts that are not maybe so excited about property rights will use that case in ways that were unintended. So Nolan and Dolan, they're both about someone just wants a permit and they're asked to do these things that don't have much to do with what they want to do with their property. And they're good facts because, you can kind of have this, like meddling bureaucrat, right, as part of the story, which makes a lot better than just some city council passed a law 10 years ago and you got to live with the consequences like everyone else, right? But the principle is the same. The principle is as applied to your particular property, this doesn't make sense. And it rises to the level of being a taking, just like if the city was actually taking your land away. So this is, it's some species, as we call it, of a regulatory taking. So the facts made it more, more of a winner, but the principle is the same. But then the precedent, right, is that courts that are often not all that into trying to protect someone's property rights. Maybe the facts in the next case. I mean, the facts here I think are pretty good, but then maybe the facts in the next case, maybe they're not as exciting as Nolan and Dolan, and so the court's going to say, well, we can distinguish those because they're just about, they were about some meddling bureaucrat at City Hall, and this is about a general scheme. And where we got to defer to the legislature and, maybe even throw a little rational basis in there, like you were talking about, they asked for here. And so that then creates all these other cases that go the other way that really go against the principle. And so it sounds like it's time for the Supreme Court to step in and just, reaffirm the principle that's behind all of this. Is why we have the takings clause in the first place. The court did a good job, I think, of talking about, how the idea of a taking, although it wasn't, there wasn't a constitutional principle like this, I think, under English law, the idea of that and the Blackstone that you mentioned, goes back to Parliament taking land, an act of Parliament, which is considered an act of the sovereign under English law. That applies just as much as, someone at a dinky city hall saying, well, you got to fork over some cash to get a permit.
And the court spends quite a bit of time talking about the unconstitutional conditions clause and how there's not a, all-encompassing clause. But it talks about in other areas, like First Amendment, for example, in free speech, it doesn't matter, if it's a legislative infringement on free speech or an individual, right, administrator. It's what's being infringed, not who's doing it.
I like that. It's what's being infringed. It's not who's infringing. So thank you both for coming on this all Minnesota, not about Minnesota podcast that I'm sure all Minnesotans who listen to Short Circuit will be super excited about. So Ryan and Dave, good luck in your ventures, in your cases. I'm sure you'll have more exciting cases to talk about one day on Short Circuit. And in the meantime, everyone else, please check out our jobs page, the positions that are open here at the Institute for Justice. But in the meantime, I hope that all of you get engaged.